I never thought a simple sibling argument could land me in the emergency room. Yet here I was, lying on a hospital stretcher, ribs throbbing, and my mom whispering for me to keep it quiet. My name is Harper Mills. I'm 22, and I had always considered my younger sister, Cassidy, a mischievous but harmless kid. Someone whose occasional pranks and teasing I could endure without question. But that afternoon at our family's lakeside cabin in northern Michigan, Cassidy's playful streak had crossed a line I never expected. I can still feel the sharp, searing pain in my side as if it were happening again right now. What she did wasn't an accident, and when Mom saw the evidence, her immediate reaction was not worry, it was caution, a chilling insistence that I'd handle it quietly, as though protecting Cassidy's reputation mattered more than my broken body. I knew then that the path ahead wouldn't just be about healing my ribs, it would be about discovering whose side the truth was really on, and whether anyone would listen if I spoke up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It all started earlier that morning when the sun had barely crept above the horizon, painting the lake in soft pinks and oranges. Cassidy, ever the energetic one, had dragged me outside for a friendly challenge on the dock. Some nonsense about seeing who could jump the farthest into the water. I had barely gotten my footing on the wet wood when she shoved me with more force than I expected. My back hit the dock first, and I felt an immediate bone-crushing pain shoot through my ribcage. Cassidy froze, her playful grin fading into panic, and before I could even speak, Mom appeared from the cabin, her hands on her hips, eyes narrowing as she assessed the scene. The words that followed are etched into my memory. "Harper, don't make a big deal. Let's just keep this quiet." I stared at her, stunned, trying to process the shock and the sudden betrayal I felt. My own mother, the person who should have been my first line of defense, seemed more concerned with controlling the narrative than addressing the injury before her eyes. I hobbled toward the cabin, each step sending sharp jabs of pain through my side. Cassidy trailed behind, wringing her hands and mumbling apologies, but I could tell she didn't fully grasp the seriousness of what she'd done. Mom kept hovering between us, her expression a mix of worry and calculated calm, as if she were weighing the social implications of a hospital visit rather than the physical trauma I was enduring. Inside, I felt a mix of fear and anger, a storm building that I didn't yet know how to release. I had always been the responsible sister, the one who looked out for everyone, but now I was the one who needed protection, and protection was the last thing coming my way. My ribs ached with every breath, and I knew that moving even slightly might worsen the injury. By mid-morning, the pain had become unbearable, and I realized that ignoring it was no longer an option. My head swam with a mix of guilt and frustration. I didn't want to anger Mom, I didn't want to get Cassidy into serious trouble, but my body was screaming for help. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, hunched over, trying to catch my breath, when Mom handed me an ice pack and muttered, "It's probably just bruised. Lie down, don't tell anyone." Her words were meant to soothe, I think, but instead they filled me with a sense of isolation, as if I had become a secret to be hidden, a problem that might embarrass the family if exposed. I wanted to cry, to scream, to tell someone, anyone, that something was very wrong. But all I could do was nod, clutch the ice pack to my side, and force myself to sit through the morning pretending everything was fine. Hours passed, and with each passing moment, my discomfort intensified. Every small movement, the bend of my torso, a cough, even the lift of a coffee mug, sent waves of stabbing pain across my ribs. I tried to distract myself with light chores around the cabin, but I could barely stand. Cassidy hovered nearby, awkward and guilt-ridden, occasionally muttering, "I didn't mean to. Harper, I'm sorry." I appreciated her words, but they did little to dull the reality of my condition. By late afternoon, I was pale, sweaty, and dizzy, and Mom finally conceded, albeit reluctantly, that maybe a hospital visit might be necessary. Even then, she framed it as a precaution rather than a response to real injury.
Let's just make sure it's nothing serious, she said, as though that phrase somehow minimized the sharp agony I was experiencing.
When we finally arrived at the small emergency room in the nearest town, the clinical white lights and the sterile smell hit me like a shock. A nurse guided me to a waiting area, and I sank into the stiff chair, trying to regulate my breathing. Cassidy clutched my hand in apology, her usual energy subdued, and Mom hovered nearby, looking tense but still careful not to reveal too much. As we waited, I tried to steel myself for what was to come, knowing that this was the moment when the truth would either be acknowledged or buried again. I had no idea yet that the doctor on duty, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Marlene Hatcher, would not let the situation slide by quietly. She had a way of seeing beneath the surface, of recognizing when a patient's story didn't match their injuries. And when she examined me, her gaze immediately went beyond my bruises and into the core of the incident. I could sense that whatever cover-up my mother hoped to maintain would crumble under Dr. Hatcher's scrutiny. Little did I know, in that moment of pain and frustration, that my day was about to turn into something far bigger than a simple hospital visit. What started as an impulsive shove by my sister and a reluctant response from my mother would soon set in motion a chain of events that none of us could ignore. I would be forced to confront not only the physical pain in my body, but also the deeper truths about family loyalty, accountability, and the courage to speak up when no one else seems willing to hear you. That single, fateful shove on the dock marked the beginning of a journey that would test every boundary I had ever known: pain, trust, and ultimately, the power of truth itself. By the time we had settled into the emergency room waiting area, the reality of the situation began to sink in. My ribs throbbed relentlessly, and every breath felt like a battle against my own body. Cassidy sat beside me, her fingers nervously tapping against her knees, occasionally glancing at Mom for reassurance, but there was none to be had. Mom herself hovered awkwardly nearby, shifting from foot to foot, her arms crossed tightly as though she were bracing herself against some unseen judgment. I could tell she was thinking about appearances, about what the hospital staff might say, and about how this incident would reflect on our family. It was almost surreal. My pain was urgent and visible, yet the people who should have been focused on helping me seemed more preoccupied with controlling the narrative. I realized, with a sinking heart, that I was now caught between two worlds: the very real physical suffering in my body and the social and emotional pressure to keep it quiet. The waiting room was a mix of faint antiseptic smell, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, and the quiet murmur of other patients trying to pass the time. I watched the various families around me, some whispering anxiously to one another, some scrolling endlessly on their phones, and I felt a strange isolation. It wasn't just that my ribs were broken, it was that I was suddenly trapped in a situation where my own story was being suppressed, where honesty was considered less important than convenience. I tried to keep my breathing steady, counting slowly, telling myself I could endure the pain a little longer. Yet every small movement, the tilt of my head, the shifting of my hand, brought a sharp flare of agony that reminded me my body had limits. Cassidy's eyes darted toward me again, full of silent guilt, but her apologies had started to lose their meaning. I didn't need apologies. I needed recognition that what happened was serious and unacceptable. Mom finally spoke, her voice low and controlled. "Harper, honey, let's not overreact. We don't want people thinking this was, well, an accident out of control. Just tell them it was a minor fall, okay?" I looked at her, stunned, the pain and disbelief making my chest tighten even more. "Minor fall?" I whispered, my teeth gritting against the ache. "I can barely breathe, Mom. This isn't minor." Her response was a soft sigh, like she was weighing her words carefully. I know, but Cassidy didn't mean it. Let's just get checked, make sure nothing is serious, and then we can go home." I wanted to scream, to tell her that getting checked wasn't the same as dismissing what happened, but the words caught in my throat. I could feel a hot anger rising in me, mingling with the physical pain, and I realized that this wasn't just about ribs, it was about accountability, about who had the right to define the truth.
When the nurse finally called my name, I was guided into an examination room, Cassidy following close behind, and Mom lingering at the door. The room was stark and efficient, with medical charts pinned to the walls and the faint hum of machines in the corner. I sat gingerly on the examination table, trying not to move too much, while Cassidy and Mom hovered nearby. Dr. Marlene Hatcher entered, clipboard in hand, her expression focused and professional. From the moment she glanced at me, I could tell she wasn't someone who would accept half-truths or polite omissions. She gave a small nod and, with a calm but firm tone, said, "Harper, I need to understand exactly what happened, and I need you to be honest with me." There was an intensity in her gaze, a sense that she could see through any story that didn't match the injuries in front of her. Mom's hand tightened around Cassidy's shoulder, as if silently warning her to stay quiet. But I felt a strange relief wash over me. Finally, someone was going to listen. I tried to explain the incident as clearly as possible, recounting the moment on the dock when Cassidy shoved me, the sharp impact against the wood, and the sudden pain that followed. Mom interjected softly, trying to soften my words. "It was just a little accident, doctor. Nothing serious." Dr. Hatcher raised her eyes to meet Mom's, unflinching, and said, "I'll be the judge of how serious it is. Right now, we need to focus on Harper's health." It was a small but powerful affirmation, and I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly, not because the pain was gone, but because my story was finally being validated. Cassidy looked at me with wide eyes, her earlier mischief replaced by something closer to fear, and I realized she was beginning to understand that the consequences of her actions were real. As Dr. Hatcher conducted a careful examination, pressing gently around my rib cage, asking me to take shallow breaths and describe the pain, I became acutely aware of how much I had been taught to suppress my own needs. Growing up, I had always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over fights, avoided conflict, and prioritized others' feelings above my own. But in this room, under the clinical scrutiny of a professional who could not be swayed by appearances or family pressure, I felt a new kind of empowerment beginning to recruit. Every sharp intake of breath, every wince of pain became a piece of evidence not just of my broken ribs, but of a larger truth, that my experience mattered, that what had happened could not be dismissed, and that someone needed to hold Cassidy accountable. Dr. Hatcher nodded thoughtfully after a few minutes, her hands hovering over the chart as she made notes. "Harper," she said, turning fully to face Mom, "this isn't minor. She's got at least 3 fractured ribs, possibly 4. This requires more than just ice and rest. We need x-rays, and then we'll discuss treatment." Mom's face paled slightly, her earlier composure slipping as the reality sunk in. I felt a mixture of vindication and frustration. Finally, someone had confirmed what I already knew. What Cassidy had done was serious, and pretending otherwise was impossible. Cassidy leaned forward, whispering softly, "I didn't mean to hurt you like this." But her voice trembled, betraying the fear she felt about what was coming next. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let Dr. Hatcher continue, knowing that the medical facts would speak louder than any words of apology or attempts to hush the truth. As the nurse led me down the hall for x-rays, Mom followed silently, her earlier insistence on secrecy replaced by quiet tension. Cassidy stayed beside me, hands clasped tightly in hers. For the first time that day, I felt like the truth might actually matter. Not just my pain, but the principle of honesty, accountability, and the courage to face the consequences. What had begun as a painful shove on a lakeside dock was now transforming into something much bigger, an awakening to the fact that silence wasn't always safe, that hiding injuries or misdeeds didn't protect anyone, and that standing up for oneself sometimes meant defying the people you loved most. The moment I saw the x-ray images, I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. Dr. Hatcher had positioned the film against the light box, and the shadows of my fractured ribs were impossible to ignore. 3 distinct breaks on my right side, each angled slightly differently, and a 4th crack forming near the center. Proof that Cassidy's shove had been far more forceful than anyone in my family had wanted to admit. I could barely breathe without wincing, and each cough brought a stabbing pain that shot from my ribs to my back. Mom's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, but there was no comfort in it. Instead, there was a tension, almost a calculation in her eyes, as if she were weighing how to control what would come next. Cassidy looked pale, her usual energy gone, replaced by the dawning realization that the situation was far beyond anything she had anticipated.
Dr. Hatcher studied the X-rays with a clinical eye, her brow furrowed in concentration. She then turned toward Mom, her tone firm but professional. "Mrs. Langley," she began, using Mom's real name for the first time in the room, "these injuries are serious. Harper is in considerable pain, and she needs immediate treatment. This isn't a minor incident you can ignore. It needs documentation, and we need to consider whether this was accidental or otherwise." Mom's eyes flicked toward me and Cassidy, and I could sense her discomfort. Her earlier insistence that we keep it quiet now clashed directly with Dr. Hatcher's insistence on transparency. I felt a surge of relief. For the first time that day, someone outside our family recognized the reality of what had happened, and it didn't matter who wanted to hide it. Cassidy's voice was barely audible as she whispered, "Harper, I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would hurt this much." I looked at her, my chest tight not only from pain, but from the mixture of emotions swirling inside me. Part of me wanted to yell, to tell her that carelessness had consequences, that recklessness carried weight. Yet another part of me, the one that had grown up protecting her and smoothing over her mistakes, hesitated. Dr. Hatcher must have sensed the tension because she interjected gently. "Cassidy, accidents happen, but the priority now is ensuring Harper receives proper care. Truth and honesty are part of that care. Right now, hiding anything will only make things worse." Her words resonated in a way that Mom's attempts to silence me never could. They made the situation tangible. The secret we had been keeping was no longer an option. The nurse guided me toward a private treatment room, and Mom and Cassidy followed silently. I was still trying to regulate my breathing, but every movement reminded me of just how fragile my ribs were. As I lay back on the hospital bed, Dr. Hatcher explained the plan: pain management, monitoring for internal injury, and a follow-up with a trauma specialist. She paused, then added, "Given the nature of these fractures, I'll need a detailed account of how this happened for medical records. Accuracy is critical, Harper. Can you tell me exactly what occurred?" My heart pounded, a mixture of fear and resolve swelling inside me. For weeks, I had suppressed the incident, tried to rationalize it, and followed Mom's instructions to keep it quiet. But now, confronted with a professional who demanded the truth, I realized I couldn't keep lying, not only for my own health, but for my own sense of justice and self-respect. I took a deep breath and began recounting everything from the dock that morning. The playful challenge Cassidy had proposed, the shove that sent me crashing, the sharp pain that shot through my ribs, and my attempts to conceal the injury at Mom's insistence. I spoke slowly, deliberately, emphasizing the intensity of the pain and my inability to move without wincing. Dr. Hatcher listened attentively, nodding occasionally and making careful notes on her clipboard. She asked follow-up questions, clarifying angles, movements, and force, each one reinforcing that my account was being taken seriously. Meanwhile, Mom's face hardened, her eyes darting between me and Cassidy, clearly wrestling with how to maintain control in a situation that was quickly slipping beyond her grasp. Cassidy's gaze remained fixed on the floor, shame and fear battling with relief that finally someone outside our family was listening. The breaking point was undeniable. I realized that my body was no longer something I could ignore, that my suffering was real, and that trying to protect Cassidy or appease Mom came at a too high a cost. Dr. Hatcher's intervention had transformed the dynamic entirely. The incident was no longer a secret to be hushed, a minor family mishap to be smoothed over with quiet assurances. It was a documented reality, a serious injury demanding proper care, accountability, and honesty. In that moment, I understood something fundamental.
Sometimes it takes an outside perspective, someone with the authority to enforce truth, to break through the layers of family loyalty and social pressure that keep abuse or recklessness hidden. For the first time, I felt the scales tip in my favor, not just physically, but morally. I was no longer just a victim hiding my pain. I was someone whose voice mattered, whose story had to be heard, and whose rights to proper care could not be denied.
By the time the treatment process began, pain medication administered, ice packs and supports applied, instructions given for careful movement, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and empowerment. The ordeal that had started with a careless shove and a whispered plea for secrecy was evolving into a confrontation with truth, one that had far-reaching implications for our family. It was clear that Cassidy and Mom would have to face the reality of their actions, and I would no longer remain silent for the sake of convenience. My ribs ached, yes, but something deeper, something heavier than pain had shifted. I had crossed a point of no return, and the events of that day would set the stage for decisions, confrontations, and reckonings that none of us could avoid. By the time the x-rays were completed and confirmed, it was impossible for anyone to deny the severity of my injuries. Dr. Hatcher returned to the room, her expression serious, carrying the printed images and my chart. Mom and Cassidy were there, standing silently, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. Dr. Hatcher placed the x-rays on the light box once more, pointing to each fracture. "These are significant breaks," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Harper will need careful monitoring and possibly follow-up treatment to ensure no complications. Additionally, this needs to be documented accurately. I'm required to note how this injury occurred, and your honesty is essential, Mrs. Langley." Mom's face tightened, a brief flash of panic crossing her features, and I realized she was confronting the reality she had been trying to avoid all morning. This was no longer a private family incident that could be swept under the rug. I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety as Dr. Hatcher spoke. Relief because finally someone with authority recognized that I had been hurt and that the circumstances surrounding my injury mattered. Anxiety because I knew Mom's protective instinct for Cassidy could make the next few hours and even the days to come complicated. Cassidy had been hovering near the bed, wringing her hands, her expression guilty and fearful. I could see she was aware of the gravity of the situation, that the casual shove she had delivered earlier that morning was no longer just a mistake. It was evidence. And with Dr. Hatcher's insistence on documentation, the truth was being formalized, captured in the sterile, unyielding logic of medical records. It was a moment that marked the first point of no return. My body, my pain, and my story had become undeniable facts that could not be dismissed or hidden. Mom finally spoke, her voice low and tense. "Dr. Hatcher, surely this is just an accident. Cassidy didn't mean to hurt her. Can't we just handle it ourselves?" The words dripped with protective defensiveness, but Dr. Hatcher's response was immediate and firm. "Mrs. Langley, the law requires me to record accurate information regarding how this injury occurred. Harper's safety and proper care depend on transparency. It isn't about punishment, it's about truth and medical responsibility. Anything less could put her at risk." I felt a surge of gratitude toward Dr. Hatcher. In that moment, she was more than a doctor. She was an advocate, a catalyst for truth in a room where my family had, however inadvertently, been suppressing it. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could sense that Mom was realizing she couldn't control the narrative anymore, not in the presence of a professional insisting on accountability. Cassidy's eyes flicked to me, and I noticed the mixture of fear and remorse etched on her face. She opened her mouth, likely to apologize again, but no words seemed adequate. For the first time, I could truly understand the consequences of her actions, beyond mere parental scolding or casual guilt. This was real, tangible, and documented, and she could no longer frame it as a harmless prank. I took a deep, careful breath, wincing as pain shot through my ribs, and I realized I had the power to tell the full story now, in a way that mattered. I could no longer acquiesce to Mom's plea for silence. The medical facts and Dr. Hatcher's authority had elevated my voice, and I could feel the shift. What I said next would no longer be optional, and hiding the truth was no longer possible. Dr. Hatcher turned her attention fully toward me. Harper, I need you to describe the events in your own words. Detail everything that led to these fractures. Be specific about movements, interactions, and the forces involved. My heart pounded, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I began recounting the morning's events again, this time in precise detail. Cassidy's challenge on the dock, the shove, my sudden fall, the sharp pain, and my attempts to keep quiet at Mom's urging. I described every twist, every twinge of pain, every moment where I had tried to mask my suffering. Dr. Hatcher listened with careful attention, jotting notes, asking follow-ups, and occasionally nodding as if to validate my words. I noticed that Mom's gaze shifted constantly, flicking between the X-rays, Dr. Hatcher, Cassidy, and me. I could see the dawning realization that the family's internal attempts at secrecy were crumbling in real time.
When I finished, Dr. Hatcher looked at Mom and Cassidy with unwavering eyes. This is serious. It must be treated seriously. Minimizing it or altering details will only jeopardize Harper's care and could have long-term consequences. Mom's lips pressed tightly together, and she finally nodded, her authority waning under the weight of undeniable evidence. Cassidy, meanwhile, had her hands pressed to her face, clearly overwhelmed by the recognition that the incident had moved beyond casual family dynamics into something that demanded responsibility. I felt a sense of resolve hardening inside me. The fractures weren't just physical, they represented a rupture in the narrative my family had been trying to maintain. This was the moment when hiding the truth was no longer an option. As the nurse prepared the necessary supports, elastic wraps for my ribs, instructions for careful movement, and pain management protocols, Dr. Hatcher explained that the incident would be formally documented in my medical chart and might require follow-up with a trauma specialist. She emphasized the importance of honesty and insisted that the truth be reflected in every step of my care. For the first time that day, I felt a sense of empowerment that had nothing to do with the pain in my ribs. My story was being recognized, my voice validated, and the consequences of Cassidy's actions were now a matter of official record. It was no longer just about enduring the aftermath silently. It was about accountability, recognition, and the knowledge that my suffering could not be ignored. When we finally left the hospital hours later, my ribs wrapped and supported, pain medication coursing through my system, the dynamic within the family had shifted irreversibly. Mom was subdued, Cassidy quiet and guilt-ridden, and I carried with me a newfound understanding. The shove that had caused all of this was not just an accident. It was a turning point, a moment that would demand honesty, confrontation, and eventual resolution. The point of no return had been crossed, and I knew the days ahead would test our family in ways none of us were prepared for, forcing us to confront truths we had long avoided. The next morning, I woke with my ribs still throbbing, a constant reminder of how fragile my body had become. Every movement, even turning slightly in bed, brought fresh waves of pain, and I had to carefully calculate each step before attempting to get out of the cabin. Cassidy had stayed near my side throughout the night, occasionally checking to see if I needed anything, her face drawn and pale. Mom, on the other hand, was quieter than usual, a stark contrast to her usual insistence on control and appearances. She hovered around the kitchen, preparing breakfast with tense precision, occasionally glancing toward us as if to ensure that we were following an unspoken protocol of silence. The quiet tension was suffocating, a pressure that compounded the physical ache in my ribs. I realized that while the external medical validation had shifted the balance of power somewhat, the internal dynamics of my family were still charged and volatile, and navigating them required delicate calculation. Pain aside, I felt a renewed determination to ensure that the truth of what had happened was fully recognized. Dr. Hatcher's firm stance had reinforced something I had suspected for weeks. Ignoring the situation or protecting Cassidy would only harm me further. And yet the challenge was clear. How could I enforce accountability in a household where loyalty and denial had long masked reality?
Mom had already shown she preferred discretion over confrontation, and Cassidy, though remorseful, still didn't fully comprehend the consequences of her actions. I knew the next few days would be pivotal in shaping how this situation unfolded, and I braced myself for the conflicts that were inevitably going to rise. The first pinch point, the moment where opposition and resistance intensified, had begun. By mid-morning, we received a follow-up call from Dr. Hatcher, requesting that I return for a detailed review of my x-rays and a formal consultation with the trauma specialist. Mom hesitated before agreeing, clearly weighing the social and familial implications of another hospital visit. Cassidy, standing nearby, looked ready to shrink away, fearing further scrutiny. I realized that while the medical authority was on my side, the emotional and relational opposition within my own family could complicate matters just as severely. Driving to the hospital, I felt each bump in the road reverberate through my ribs, sending sharp jolts of pain through my side. Yet, despite the discomfort, I felt a growing courage. The fractures themselves were a visible, undeniable proof of Cassidy's actions, and I intended to make sure that this evidence wasn't ignored or minimized, no matter how much resistance I faced from my family.
When we arrived at the hospital, the trauma specialist, Dr. Simon Reyes, greeted us with a professional warmth that immediately put me at ease. He reviewed my x-rays carefully and then asked me to recount the incident once more. I felt the weight of expectation, not only from the doctor, but also from Cassidy and Mom, who were watching my every word and reaction. I described the shove, the fall, and the sequence of pain that followed. Dr. Reyes listened attentively, asking precise questions about angles, intensity, and timing. Each answer I gave reinforced the objective truth of the situation. My body was injured, and the injury had a clear, identifiable cause. Yet, I could sense the growing unease from my family. Mom's attempts to manage appearances were becoming strained, her control slipping as the objective evidence mounted. Cassidy's guilt was now intertwined with fear. The consequences were tangible, and for the first time, she seemed to grasp that this was no longer a minor family squabble. After a thorough evaluation, Dr. Reyes concluded that my ribs were indeed fractured and emphasized the importance of avoiding any further strain. "These injuries are significant," he said. "They will heal, but improper care or attempts to mask pain could lead to complications. Honesty about what happened, both in the household and in any documentation, is critical for safe recovery." His words reinforced what Dr. Hatcher had already stated. The truth was no longer optional, and the repercussions of silence could be severe. Mom nodded slowly, but her eyes were tight, reflective of the tension between maintaining control and acknowledging the facts. Cassidy's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I noticed the weight of responsibility pressing on her small frame. She had been shielded for so long, but now reality was closing in. Driving home, the tension in the car was almost tangible. Mom spoke sparingly, each sentence carefully crafted as though navigating a minefield. Cassidy remained quiet, glancing occasionally at me with wide, remorseful eyes, while I focused on breathing evenly and managing the sharp pangs in my ribs. I knew that the rising opposition within the family was not malicious in the sense of intent to harm. It was rooted in denial, fear, and the instinct to preserve appearances. But it was still resistance. It was a subtle, persistent challenge to my insistence on truth and accountability, and I could sense that navigating this internal opposition would require both patience and resolve. Over the next few days, the opposition continued to mount. Mom would occasionally remind me in quiet tones that drawing attention to the incident could create embarrassment or conflict. Cassidy, while apologetic, sometimes acted as if minimizing the situation could undo the consequences of her actions. I realized that this was part of the natural pushback. Truth and accountability often meet resistance, particularly when loyalty, fear, or shame are involved. But each pang of pain in my ribs, each careful step I had to take to avoid worsening the fractures, became a physical reminder that the objective reality could not be ignored, and the evidence of harm was tangible, undeniable, and inescapable.
it became clear that the first pinch point had fully arrived. The struggle between truth and avoidance, accountability and denial was intensifying. The rising opposition wasn't just external, it was internal, within my family, where loyalty and fear threatened to obscure the facts. But the fractures in my ribs, the documented medical evidence, and the validation from Dr. Hatcher and Dr. Reyes were powerful counterweights, reinforcing that the path forward required courage, honesty, and a steadfast refusal to let the situation be hidden or dismissed. Each day was a test, each interaction a negotiation, and I was learning that advocating for myself required more than simply speaking. It required persistence, strategy, and the willingness to confront even those I loved most. By midweek, the physical reality of my fractured ribs had become undeniable, not just to me, but to everyone around me. The pain was constant, a deep, gnawing ache that flared with every movement. Even sitting upright or leaning slightly forward brought stabbing reminders of Cassidy's shove. But the most profound change was in the air around the house, the subtle shift in how truth was being confronted. After my follow-up appointments with Dr. Reyes, it became clear that the fractures were not only serious, but any attempt to downplay them could endanger my health. The objective proof had arrived, crystallized in medical reports, X-rays, and the professional insistence that my injuries be taken seriously. This was the major revelation, the moment when denial could no longer obscure reality. Mom's composure was fragile now. I could see it in the way she walked through the house, glancing at me and then at Cassidy, as if trying to negotiate between concern for her injured child and instinctive protection for the one who caused the harm. Cassidy, meanwhile, was quiet, tense, and withdrawn. It was as though the weight of her actions, combined with the undeniable evidence, had finally settled fully in her consciousness. Even small gestures, a wince when I shifted in bed, the careful way I moved through the kitchen, seemed to make her hyper-aware of the consequences she had triggered. The fractures, once invisible beneath my skin, had now become a living symbol of accountability, proof that actions, even impulsive ones, carry tangible results.
The undeniable proof extended beyond physical evidence. At Dr. Reyes's office, I had received a detailed report outlining the severity of my injuries, treatment protocols, and the necessity of ongoing monitoring. The language was clinical, precise, and objective, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The report explicitly described the fractures, the potential complications, and the immediate need for rest and careful care. I held the document in my hands, reading every word twice, feeling a mixture of relief and vindication. Here was concrete evidence that could no longer be dismissed or reframed, a professional affirmation that what had happened to me was serious, real, and unacceptable. I also noticed a subtle shift in Cassidy's behavior. The moment she realized the magnitude of her actions, she began to act cautiously around me, her usual exuberance replaced by a careful, almost tentative approach. She would pause before speaking, soften her tone, and check with me before moving too close or initiating conversation. The change was palpable, and though her guilt was evident, it was tempered by a nascent awareness of responsibility. The fracture in our family dynamic, the emotional rift created by her impulsive shove, was mirrored by the literal fracture in my ribs. Both demanded acknowledgement, care, and accountability. Mom's attitude, however, remained complicated. She oscillated between concern for my well-being and unease about the potential consequences for Cassidy. There were moments when she would sit quietly beside me, gently asking if I needed anything, and then quickly shift to admonishing Cassidy about being more careful, as though the solution lay in minor adjustments rather than confronting the severity of the incident. But even her attempts at control were undermined by the undeniable evidence. The X-rays, the medical reports, and my persistent pain created a situation she could no longer manage through denial or persuasion. The truth had become unavoidable. And the major revelation of this story was that external validation from professionals like Dr. Hatcher and Dr. Reyes had dismantled the protective shields of secrecy. I began to recognize that this was more than a personal victory. It was a turning point for the family as a whole. The fractures had forced a confrontation with reality that Mom and Cassidy could no longer avoid. Conversations became more direct.
questions more pointed, and moments of silence carried weight. Where once I had been silenced and urged to overlook my own suffering, now my pain dictated the pace of interactions. Every careful breath, every tentative movement was a constant reminder of the objective truth. The fractures were not just physical, they were symbols of accountability, evidence that actions have consequences, and proof that truth cannot be indefinitely suppressed. I began to feel a quiet sense of empowerment, a knowledge that standing firm in the face of opposition was not only justified, but essential. As the days passed, the major revelation continued to reverberate through our home. Conversations became more honest, interactions more cautious but sincere, and the fractures in my ribs became a persistent reminder of the consequences of recklessness and the importance of accountability. The evidence was objective, the validation was real, and the family dynamic was beginning to shift in response. The path forward was now clear. Honesty, acknowledgement, and careful care for both my physical and emotional recovery would guide the next steps. The truth was no longer avoidable. It had arrived fully, undeniable and unyielding, and the consequences for all of us would be shaped by how we responded to it. After the major revelation confirmed by Dr. Reyes, I assumed that the worst was behind me, that acknowledgement and evidence would settle the tension and allow us to move toward resolution. I was wrong. In the days that followed, the situation escalated into something far more complex and emotionally charged than I had anticipated. The fractures in my ribs were healing slowly, each small movement a sharp reminder of the day Cassidy had shoved me, but the emotional fractures within our family had begun to deepen. Mom, who had previously oscillated between concern and control, became increasingly defensive, not just of Cassidy, but of herself. She seemed to view the acknowledgement of truth as a threat, as though admitting the severity of my injury reflected poorly on her as a parent. Her anxiety and tension radiated through the house, creating an invisible barrier between us, one that I could feel with every cautious step I took to avoid worsening the pain in my side.
Cassidy's guilt was no longer tentative. It had solidified into a quiet, oppressive presence that hung over every interaction. She avoided eye contact, spoke softly, and seemed to shrink away whenever I tried to acknowledge her. Yet, despite her visible remorse, there was a part of her that resisted full responsibility. She would mutter excuses under her breath, justifications that tried to frame the incident as unintentional, a mishap that shouldn't carry lasting consequences. I found myself growing frustrated, not with her, entirely, but with the persistence of denial. The truth had been confirmed medically. The fractures were documented and undeniable. Yet, emotionally and relationally, the resistance was still strong. It was as though the facts alone were insufficient to break the pattern of avoidance and silence that had defined our family for years. I realized that this moment marked the second plot point, the all-is-lost juncture in my personal journey. The physical injury, the documented fractures, and the professional validation should have been enough to settle matters, but instead, they sparked a new challenge, deciding whether to continue protecting Cassidy or to fully assert my right to speak the truth and demand accountability. My body was still weak and sore, but my mind was active, weighing consequences and preparing for confrontation. The realization struck me sharply. If I remained silent now, I would be complicit in allowing negligence and recklessness to persist. The fractures in my ribs had become more than physical. They were symbols of unacknowledged harm, and I could no longer tolerate half measures or quiet compromise. The tipping point arrived one evening during dinner. Mom, Cassidy, and I sat at the small kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken tension. Mom tried to keep the conversation light, making small talk about weekend plans and weather, but I could feel the simmering undercurrent, the tension between denial and truth, between the desire to protect and the need to confront reality. I finally spoke up, my voice trembling slightly from both pain and emotion. Mom, Cassidy, we can't just pretend this didn't happen. I'm still in pain. My ribs are fractured, and the doctors have made it very clear that this was serious. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to talk about what comes next. Mom's fork clattered against her plate, her eyes narrowing as she met my gaze. Harper,
You're overreacting. Cassidy didn't mean for this to happen. Can't we just move on? Her words were meant to calm, to redirect, but they had the opposite effect. They crystallized for me the necessity of taking a firm stand. Cassidy looked down at her plate, her small hands trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered almost inaudibly. "I didn't think it would be this bad." I nodded, acknowledging her words, but the anger and frustration that had been simmering beneath my calm surface surged forward. I said, "It doesn't matter if you meant to or not. The fact is that I'm hurt, and it needs to be taken seriously. We can't sweep this under the rug anymore. The doctors have made that very clear, and I won't keep quiet about it just to protect anyone." Mom's face strained of color, and for a moment she seemed stunned. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, each heartbeat echoing in my chest as if marking the gravity of the moment. For hours that evening, the confrontation played out in subtle, charged ways. Mom and Cassidy tried to minimize, justify, and redirect. But I held firm, insisting on recognition of the severity and the consequences. The emotional toll was nearly as severe as the physical pain in my ribs. I felt isolated, despite being in the same room as the two people I loved most. It was an all-or-nothing moment, the choice to speak the truth fully, despite potential backlash, or to remain silent and allow avoidance to persist unchecked. I realized that the fractures in my ribs were now symbols of the fractures in our family dynamic, and that ignoring either would cause deeper, long-lasting harm. The weight of responsibility was enormous. Speaking the truth meant risking anger, confrontation, and even resentment from my mother and sister. Yet silence felt worse. It was as though the very act of acknowledging my pain, my experience, and the accountability owed was a moral imperative that could not be ignored. That evening, I made a conscious choice. I would no longer protect Cassidy from the consequences of her actions. I would speak truthfully, insist on proper acknowledgement, and ensure that the situation was addressed fully, both medically and relationally. The point of no return had solidified, not physically, but emotionally and morally. I had chosen to confront reality, regardless of the personal cost or family tension it would create. By the time I went to bed that night, my ribs still ached fiercely, but I felt a measure of inner resolve I hadn't experienced before. The fracture in my body mirrored the fracture in my family, and I understood that addressing one required confronting the other. The choice to speak, to insist on recognition, and to assert accountability marked a turning point. It was the all-is-lost moment that paradoxically revealed a path forward. Through confrontation, honesty, and courage, there was a chance for healing, not just of my body, but of the fractured dynamics within our family.
The confrontation began subtly, almost imperceptibly, but the tension in the house was now palpable, a charged energy that seemed to settle over every room. Mom had retreated into her habitual role of protector, but now her protective instincts clashed with the undeniable truth of my injuries. Each movement I made, rising from a chair, reaching for a glass of water, or even shifting in bed, was a visible reminder of the consequences of Cassidy's actions. The fractures in my ribs were not just physical, they were symbols of accountability, a constant proof that could not be dismissed or minimized. Cassidy, sensing the gravity of the situation, became increasingly guarded. Every word, every gesture was measured. The playful, impulsive sister I knew had been replaced by a cautious, remorseful figure, weighed down by guilt and fear of further confrontation. The pressure intensified when Dr. Hatcher called for a follow-up to review my healing progress and to evaluate the ongoing treatment plan. Mom insisted on accompanying me, though her mood was subdued and tense. Cassidy, too, tagged along, her demeanor almost apologetic. Dr. Hatcher's office was clinical and efficient, yet the air seemed to thrum with the emotional weight I brought into the room. As Dr. Hatcher examined me, pressing gently on my ribs, she asked pointed questions about how the incident had unfolded, how pain was being managed at home, and whether there had been any complications or delays in seeking treatment. Mom answered carefully, her words measured, attempting to downplay aspects of the incident without contradicting the medical reality. Cassidy fidgeted beside her, guilt evident in her posture, and I could feel the strain building as the implicit tension between truth and avoidance grew more acute. Dr. Hatcher paused, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed my chart. Harper, it's clear that your injuries are healing, but the incident itself raises questions about accountability and safety, she said, her gaze moving from me to Mom and then to Cassidy. I need to know that you're all taking this seriously and that steps are being taken to prevent anything similar from happening again. Mom's hand rested lightly on Cassidy's arm, almost instinctively protective, and yet the subtle authority in Dr. Hatcher's voice created a counterbalance that Mom could not easily override. The pressure mounted. It was no longer just about my ribs, but about responsibility, honesty, and the future actions of everyone involved. I realized this was the second pinch point, the mounting confrontation where the opposition to truth would peak and where my insistence on accountability would be tested against resistance. Cassidy's eyes met mine briefly, filled with fear and regret. I know I messed up, she admitted softly, barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to hurt you like this, Harper. I'll be more careful. I promise. Her words, while sincere, carried the weight of tension. There was a clear undercurrent of anxiety about what more careful truly meant. Mom chimed in immediately, attempting to mediate. It was an accident. Cassidy's learned her lesson. We don't need to dwell on it or make it worse. But Dr. Hatcher, firm and unwavering, countered. Accident or not, the impact was serious. Minimizing it now could create health risks and emotional complications. The truth must guide how we move forward. Her insistence forced Mom and Cassidy to confront reality fully, highlighting the growing pressure that truth had now imposed on our household. Over the next few days, the confrontation intensified at home. Mom oscillated between protective insistence on downplaying the incident and reluctant acknowledgement of my ongoing pain. Cassidy, meanwhile, vacillated between guilt and defensiveness, occasionally muttering justifications for her actions, as though trying to balance accountability with a desire to escape consequence. The mounting pressure became almost physical. I could feel the tension in the air pressing against my ribs, each movement a painful reminder that truth was now unavoidable. Conversations became cautious, punctuated by silences, loaded with emotion. It was clear that the fractures in my body had catalyzed fractures in our family dynamic, forcing long-avoided confrontations to the surface. One afternoon, Cassidy tried to approach me, her voice tentative. Harper, I don't want you to be mad at me forever. Can we just move past this? Her attempted downplay the emotional weight of the incident triggered a surge of frustration I could no longer contain. Cassidy, I said firmly, though careful not to strain my ribs, this isn't about being mad. It's about recognizing the seriousness of what happened and taking responsibility. I can't just ignore the fact that I'm hurt and that this could have been prevented. Her eyes widened, the gravity of my words sinking in. Mom remained silent, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of the confrontation, her protective instincts now challenged by the need to face reality. The mounting pressure continued into the evening, manifesting in subtle but significant ways. Mom monitored Cassidy closely, reminding her to check in with me, to be cautious, and to respect my pain. Cassidy, though remorseful, often tried to shrink away, clearly struggling with the responsibilities she now carried. The emotional tension was mirrored by the physical reality of my ribs, which ached with every movement and reminded everyone of the seriousness of the incident. In a sense, the fractures had become living evidence of accountability, a constant presence that made denial and minimization impossible.
By the end of the week, it became evident that the confrontation had reached a peak. The truth was no longer optional, and the pressure for acknowledgement and change had intensified to a breaking point. Mom's attempts to control appearances were continually undermined by the visible and documented injuries, while Cassidy's internal struggle with guilt and responsibility created an emotional landscape charged with tension. The fractures in my ribs had catalyzed a confrontation with accountability, forcing every family member to confront the consequences of actions and decisions they could no longer ignore. It was clear that the resolution, when it came, would demand courage, honesty, and a willingness to face difficult truths. The next few days felt like wading through a fog that never lifted, each moment heavy with pain and the weight of confrontation. My ribs throbbed relentlessly, even with careful support and medication, making every breath a sharp reminder of the incident that had sparked this turmoil. But it wasn't just the physical pain that weighed on me. It was the emotional aftermath, the fallout of insisting on truth in a household that still wanted to cling to denial. Mom had retreated into quiet defensiveness, her eyes constantly darting toward Cassidy and me, assessing whether the fragile peace of appearances was at risk. Cassidy herself had become almost ghost-like, hovering near me but careful not to draw attention, her guilt tangible and unrelenting. The combination of physical injury and emotional strain created a suffocating atmosphere, and I realized I had reached the lowest point of the ordeal, the dark night of the soul. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what it meant to speak truth in a family environment resistant to accountability. Every attempt to assert my needs and insist on recognition of my pain seemed to generate subtle backlash. Sharp words, masked as concern, quiet admonishments, even passive-aggressive gestures. Mom would sigh heavily whenever I shifted too quickly, shaking her head as though I were exaggerating. Cassidy, still remorseful, sometimes muttered defensive justifications for her actions under her breath, as though explaining herself might lessen the consequences she now faced. It was exhausting. I had crossed the threshold into advocating for my own well-being, but doing so meant navigating not just my own pain, but the resistance of those who wanted to maintain comfort over truth. The sense of isolation became most acute one evening as I lay in my bedroom, ice pack pressed to my ribs, feeling the slow pulse of pain with each breath. I thought about the sequence of events: Cassidy's shove, the fall, Mom's initial insistence on secrecy, the intervention of Dr. Hatcher and Dr. Reyes, and now the ongoing tension in the household. It was as if every step forward in asserting the truth brought with it a fresh layer of emotional resistance, a counterweight of fear, guilt, and denial. I felt lonely, despite being surrounded by the very people who were supposed to care for me. It was a paradox. The closer I moved toward truth and accountability, the more isolated I became in my insistence on confronting reality. That night, I found myself questioning whether speaking up had been worth it. My ribs ached unbearably, and even small movements, like rolling over in bed, sent sharp pangs through my side. My family's tension made the environment emotionally suffocating, and I wondered if silence would have spared me both the physical pain and the emotional conflict. I reflected on Mom's words from earlier in the week, urging me to let it go and avoid unnecessary drama. Yet despite her pleas, I couldn't ignore the fractures in my body and the underlying truth that needed recognition. The sense of doubt gnawed at me. Had I made the right choice by refusing to stay silent? The pressure was relentless, the isolation deepening with every passing hour. The emotional toll manifested in exhaustion, frustration, and intermittent despair. Even the small tasks of daily life became monumental challenges. Lifting a glass, walking upstairs, or carrying laundry. Each action reminded me of the fracture in my ribs and of the responsibility I had assumed by refusing to conceal the incident. The ripple effects extended into my interactions with Cassidy and Mom. Cassidy would sometimes approach me, seeking forgiveness or reassurance, but her words felt like a double-edged sword, proof of her recognition of wrongdoing, yet also reminders of the guilt and tension that now defined our relationship.
Mom, meanwhile, oscillated between cautious acknowledgement and subtle attempts to mediate or redirect attention, her fear of conflict clashing with her need to maintain authority. As the days progressed, the emotional pressure compounded with the physical. I began to notice that even brief interactions required careful emotional calibration. Every question from Mom about my pain, every timid glance from Cassidy, every neutral observation in the room carried layers of meaning and subtext. The fractures in my ribs were mirrored by fractures in trust, communication, and family dynamics. I realized that this period, the dark night of the soul, was not about a single confrontation or a single moment of pain. It was about the slow, grinding reality of insisting on truth in an environment resistant to it. It was about isolation, doubt, and the exhaustion of holding firm while those around me struggled to align their actions with reality.
In a quiet moment late one night, I journaled about the experience, recording not just the sequence of events, but the emotions, the doubts, and the tiny victories. Writing allowed me to process the raw intensity of my situation. I noted how the physical injury demanded acknowledgement, how the emotional fractures could not be ignored, and how insisting on accountability, though exhausting, was a necessary act of self-preservation. I acknowledged the pain, the frustration, and the isolation, recognizing that these feelings were part of the journey toward resolution. In doing so, I felt the faintest stirrings of resolve, a quiet understanding that the lowest point was temporary, a crucible from which clarity, confrontation, and eventual vindication could emerge. Even in the darkest moments, I sensed the trajectory of the story shifting. The fractures in my ribs, the professional validation, and the mounting pressure on my family had created conditions that demanded confrontation, truth, and responsibility. Though I felt exhausted physically and emotionally, I understood that the next steps, final confrontation, accountability, and resolution, were approaching. The dark night of the soul was the necessary pause before the final push, the emotional nadir that would allow courage, clarity, and vindication to emerge. Though isolated and in pain, I began to recognize my own inner strength, the resilience that would carry me into the climactic moments to come. The day of reckoning arrived quietly, without fanfare, but the weight of it was undeniable. I woke that morning with my ribs still tender, the ache persistent, but there was a new clarity coursing through me, a sense that the long, tense standoff within my family was approaching a necessary climax. Mom was unusually subdued, moving around the house with careful attention but a distinct lack of her usual control-driven energy. Cassidy, sensing the gravity of the day, hovered anxiously near me, her movements tentative and her words careful. I felt the same tension I had experienced in the hospital rooms with Dr. Hatcher and Dr. Reyes, but now it was compounded by the emotional stakes at home. This was the moment where truth would be confronted fully, not just by professionals, but by the people whose lives were intertwined with mine. We sat down at the kitchen table after breakfast, a stack of medical documents between us, along with the x-rays and notes from both Dr. Hatcher and Dr. Reyes. I had spent the previous night organizing the evidence, carefully laying out each piece in chronological order, making sure that every detail, from the morning of the shove to the follow-up treatments, was clearly documented. My ribs ached as I shifted slightly to arrange the papers, but the discomfort seemed insignificant compared to the urgency I felt to ensure that the truth was not just recognized, but respected. I looked at Mom and Cassidy, my expression calm but resolute, and I knew that the moment had arrived to speak not only about the physical injury, but about the larger consequences of the incident. Mom, Cassidy, I want to go over everything that happened, clearly, so there's no confusion. I know this has been difficult, but it's important that we acknowledge the truth. Mom's eyes narrowed slightly, a mixture of apprehension and defensiveness, while Cassidy's gaze dropped to the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I laid the papers down carefully, pointing to the x-rays first. These are my ribs. You can see the fractures. This is what happened because of the shove this morning, I said, my tone firm but not accusatory.
Dr. Hatcher and Dr. Reyes have confirmed that these injuries are serious. Minimizing them or pretending they didn't happen is not an option. I'm still in pain, and I need to be treated with honesty and care. That's non-negotiable. Mom's initial response was defensive, a reflexive attempt to protect Cassidy from confrontation. Harper, it was an accident. Cassidy didn't mean to hurt you. Isn't it enough that she feels bad? Her words, though sincere, were undermined by the objective reality before her. X-rays, professional documentation, and my persistent pain. Cassidy's shoulders hunched slightly, a mix of guilt and fear. I felt the urgency to assert the truth fully, without diminishing anyone's emotions, but without allowing avoidance to persist. Mom, I said firmly, the truth isn't about blame. It's about accountability. Accident or not, I'm hurt. My body is injured. The evidence is here, and it demands recognition. Pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone. The conversation escalated in intensity, but now it was grounded in evidence, not emotion alone. I methodically walked through the sequence of events: the morning on the dock, the shove, my fall, the immediate pain, and Mom's request that I stay quiet. I referenced the medical consultations, the x-rays, and the professional advice. Each point I made was factual, precise, and supported by documentation. Mom's initial defensiveness began to crumble under the weight of this undeniable proof, while Cassidy's gaze met mine briefly, acknowledgement flickering in her eyes. She no longer avoided the responsibility. The evidence had made denial impossible.
The climactic moment came when I looked directly at Mom. "We can't ignore this anymore," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my ribs. "The doctors have documented it. I'm still recovering, and Cassidy has a responsibility to understand what her actions caused. Hiding it, pretending it's not serious, or avoiding accountability isn't an option. We need to acknowledge it fully and move forward honestly." Mom's hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. The tension in her shoulders eased, just enough to signal that the weight of denial had begun to lift. Cassidy nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes, finally internalizing the consequences of her actions and the gravity of the day's confrontation. We spent hours that morning reviewing the evidence, discussing the timeline, and outlining steps for Cassidy's accountability, as well as plans to protect my ongoing healing. It wasn't easy, the emotional tension was high, and every word felt like a delicate negotiation. But the clarity provided by objective proof allowed for resolution that had been impossible in previous days. By afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Mom's tone softened, her protective instincts recalibrated to focus on understanding and acknowledgement rather than denial. Cassidy's demeanor changed as well. Her guilt transformed into a willingness to make amends, to help with my recovery, and to actively prevent similar incidents in the future. The final push wasn't about winning an argument or exacting punishment. It was about establishing recognition, accountability, and care. The fractures in my ribs had forced a confrontation with truth that my family could no longer avoid. By presenting evidence, maintaining calm authority, and insisting on honesty, I had guided the situation to a moment of acknowledgement and clarity. The truth, undeniable and concrete, had become the focal point of the household, and the resolution of conflict had begun in earnest. The culmination of weeks of tension, fear, and resistance had arrived, and the story had reached its climactic confrontation. My voice, my pain, and my truth were finally fully heard, acknowledged, and respected. The days following the climactic confrontation brought a profound sense of change within our household. The tension that had suffocated us for weeks began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative, cautious equilibrium grounded in acknowledgement and accountability. Mom, once defensive and protective to the point of denial, shifted her focus towards support and understanding, her posture and tone reflecting an acceptance of reality rather than resistance. Cassidy, meanwhile, embraced a new awareness of her responsibility, approaching me with care and intentionality that had been absent in the immediate aftermath of the incident. It was as though the fractures in our family dynamic, once invisible, yet emotionally pervasive,
were slowly being repaired by the clear acknowledgement of the truth and the steps we were now taking together. I could feel the subtle shift in interactions throughout the house. Small gestures, Cassidy asking if I needed help carrying a blanket, Mom checking in without defensiveness, became evidence of a new rhythm. It was a rhythm built not on avoidance or silence, but on honesty, accountability, and mutual care. Even mundane tasks like preparing breakfast or tidying up carried a different weight. Each act of assistance or consideration was now informed by the understanding that actions have consequences, and that acknowledgement of harm is a prerequisite for healing. The household felt calmer, yet the change was layered and deliberate, requiring patience and conscious effort from everyone involved. I noticed how this new equilibrium affected Cassidy most profoundly. The tension and guilt that had weighed heavily on her shoulders transformed into a proactive responsibility to ensure my recovery was respected. She began helping me with small tasks, reaching items from shelves, adjusting pillows, and even assisting with meal prep to minimize the strain on my ribs. Her demeanor shifted from fearful and defensive to attentive and empathetic. Each act was a reflection not only of remorse, but also of a developing understanding of consequences and personal responsibility. The fractures in her previous impulsive behavior were being addressed through concrete actions that supported my healing and reinforced accountability. Mom's transformation, while more nuanced, was equally significant. Her protective instincts, once focused on shielding Cassidy from confrontation and external scrutiny, recalibrated to prioritize my well-being and the importance of truth. She began advocating for proper medical follow-up, ensuring I adhered to Dr. Hatcher and Dr. Reyes's advice, and providing a supportive environment for both Cassidy and me to navigate the emotional aftermath of the incident. I could see the shift in her expressions and posture, less tension, more attentiveness, and a willingness to engage in difficult conversations without reverting to denial or avoidance. It was a subtle but meaningful demonstration of the impact of evidence, accountability, and courage in transforming relational dynamics. The tangible effects of this new equilibrium extended beyond emotional support. Practical measures were also implemented to safeguard my recovery. Furniture arrangements were modified to reduce risk of further injury, and a schedule for rest, medication, and gentle movement was established. Cassidy actively participated in ensuring these protocols were followed, while Mom oversaw the process with measured guidance. The fractured dynamics that had characterized our household now found structure in deliberate, intentional actions aimed at maintaining safety and promoting healing. Even my own sense of agency grew stronger, as I could rely on both acknowledgement and support from those around me.
I realized that the process of resolution was not about erasing guilt or pain, but rather about integrating accountability into daily life. Cassidy's remorse, once raw and paralyzing, became channeled into constructive behavior, while Mom's acknowledgement of reality allowed her to participate in the family's recovery without denying the severity of the incident. The fractures in our previous patterns, avoidance, minimization, and silence, were being actively repaired through honesty, transparency, and consistent recognition of consequences. Every moment of care, every acknowledgement of responsibility, and every proactive adjustment reinforced the new equilibrium that was emerging. Emotionally, I felt a sense of validation that had been absent for weeks. The pain in my ribs, once compounded by silence and denial, was now contextualized within a framework of recognition and support. I could express discomfort without fear of minimization, ask for assistance without guilt, and assert boundaries without encountering resistance. The empowerment I felt was subtle but profound. A validation of my courage to speak truthfully, insist on acknowledgement, and demand accountability. The evidence of my injuries had forced confrontation, but the aftermath demonstrated the power of clarity, courage, and persistence in fostering change. In reflection, I understood that the new equilibrium was more than a temporary pause in tension. It was a structural shift in how our family approached accountability and care. The incident, while painful and disruptive, had created an opportunity for growth, understanding, and redefined dynamics. The fractures in both my ribs and our relationships had illuminated areas of weakness, but through deliberate acknowledgement, constructive action, and empathetic communication, those fractures were being transformed into sources of strength and resilience. The family that had once clung to denial and avoidance was now capable of facing reality, addressing mistakes, and supporting one another through consequences. By the end of the week, the household operated in a new rhythm. Cassidy's attentiveness and Mom's measured guidance combined to create an environment that was both safe and honest. I moved carefully but confidently, aware that my voice and needs were respected, and that the lessons of accountability were being internalized by those around me. The truth, once suppressed and resisted, now formed the foundation of this new equilibrium, a testament to the power of courage, validation, and the transformative potential of confronting reality fully. In this space, the fractures of the past were not forgotten, but they had been acknowledged, addressed, and integrated into a framework that allowed healing, understanding, and renewed connection to flourish. The transformation in our household did not happen overnight, but by the time the final weeks of my recovery arrived, it was undeniable. The fractures in my ribs had healed significantly, though not entirely, leaving a lingering tenderness that served as a quiet reminder of the ordeal. More importantly, the fractures in our family dynamics, the tension, denial, and avoidance, had been addressed in a way that allowed us to move forward with understanding, care, and accountability. I had emerged from the experience not only physically stronger, but emotionally fortified, having navigated pain, resistance, and confrontation while maintaining my commitment to truth. In this new reality, our family operated on a level of honesty and mutual respect that had previously seemed impossible, and the lessons learned extended far beyond the immediate incident.
Cassidy, who had initially been impulsive and careless, had evolved in remarkable ways. The weight of responsibility had forced her to reflect on her actions and understand their consequences fully. No longer the flighty, reckless girl who had shoved me in a moment of anger, she approached interactions with thoughtfulness and care. She assisted with my mobility when needed, prepared meals, and took an active role in ensuring I avoided situations that could exacerbate my healing process. But beyond the practical, there was an emotional growth that was perhaps even more significant. Cassidy's expressions of remorse were no longer fleeting or performative. They were grounded in genuine acknowledgement, proactive accountability, and a desire to make amends. Her transformation was a living testament to the power of truth and evidence in shaping behavior, a reminder that even the most impulsive actions could be tempered through reflection, responsibility, and courage. Mom's transformation was subtler but equally impactful. She had transitioned from a posture of defensive protectiveness to one of support and acceptance, demonstrating a willingness to confront reality even when it challenged her instincts. She monitored my recovery attentively, advocated for proper medical care, and participated in the ongoing conversations about accountability with calm, constructive engagement. Her protective instincts had shifted from shielding Cassidy from consequences to fostering an environment where honesty, acknowledgement, and responsibility were prioritized. Mom's growth underscored a critical lesson that recognition of truth and support for recovery could coexist with parental care, even when difficult confrontations were necessary. I, too, experienced a profound sense of personal transformation. The ordeal had forced me to confront not only physical pain, but also the complexities of navigating family dynamics under strain. I discovered reserves of patience, resilience, and assertiveness that had previously been latent. I had learned that advocating for oneself, insisting on recognition, and demanding accountability were not acts of selfishness, but essential steps in maintaining personal integrity and safety.
The courage to speak truthfully, despite potential backlash and emotional resistance, had reinforced my confidence in my own judgment and capacity for leadership within my family. I now understood the power of evidence, clear communication, and steadfastness in shaping outcomes and influencing behavior.
The home environment reflected the cumulative changes. There was a quiet attentiveness that had not existed before, moments of pause to check in, thoughtful consideration before acting, and an overall sensitivity to each other's well-being. The routines that had been disrupted by my injury, mealtimes, chores, and daily activities, were now approached with careful planning, collaboration, and mutual support. Cassidy and Mom worked together to create a safer, more mindful household, and I felt the weight of tension lift as the acknowledgement of truth became integrated into daily life. The fractures that had once dominated the atmosphere were replaced with a structure of understanding, accountability, and shared responsibility. The family had emerged not only intact, but strengthened, having confronted the consequences of impulsive action and navigated the emotional aftermath with integrity. I began to reflect on the broader implications of our experience. The incident, while painful, had catalyzed growth, understanding, and transformation. Cassidy had learned the consequences of her actions. Mom had recalibrated her protective instincts. And I had discovered the resilience and courage to assert my needs and insist on accountability. The experience had demonstrated that truth, once supported by evidence and expressed with clarity, could dismantle denial, foster responsibility, and create a foundation for healing. The fractures that had once dominated the atmosphere were replaced with a structure of understanding, accountability, and shared responsibility. As my physical recovery progressed, I embraced a renewed sense of purpose. I took on a more active role in family decision-making, ensuring that accountability and safety were prioritized in daily life. I also found that the experience had strengthened my empathy, patience, and ability to guide others through difficult situations. The ordeal had taught me that while accidents and mistakes are inevitable, the response to them, grounded in truth, responsibility, and care, determines whether growth or harm follows. The transformation was complete. I was physically recovering, emotionally resilient, and empowered to influence positive change within my family. By the time the final follow-up with Dr. Reyes arrived, the fractures in my ribs had largely healed, and the evidence of injury had become a historical marker of the journey we had endured. But more than the physical recovery, it was the transformation of our relationships, the acknowledgement of truth, and the integration of accountability into our household that marked the true victory. Cassidy, Mom, and I had moved from a space of tension, denial, and avoidance to one of honesty, support, and mutual respect. The journey had been painful, challenging, and deeply instructive, but it had resulted in a family capable of confronting truth, accepting responsibility, and cultivating lasting connection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.